How a simple man's wisdom helped a waitress defeat a millionaire. When arrogant millionaire Jonathan Howard walked into Jane's diner that rainy Tuesday morning, he thought he'd found the perfect target, a simple waitress who dared to challenge him publicly. He planned to make an example of her, ruin her career, and satisfy his wounded ego. But as Jane stood quietly in her burgundy uniform, clutching her order pad, the millionaire had no idea he'd just walked into his own destruction. Before we move further, please ensure to like, share, and subscribe for heartwarming stories like this. Likewise, tell us where you are watching from in the comment below. Jane Frank tucked a strand of blonde hair behind her ear as she wrote the day's specials on the chalkboard. The regulars watched, some engaged in conversation, others hungrily eyeing the menu. This was Jane's 10th year working at Talat Diner in Atlanta. And despite the occasional customer challenges, she loved every minute of it. "Miss Jane," called Jeremy from the corner booth. "Why do you bother with all these fancy specials? Can't we just enjoy the simple classics?" Jane smiled, setting down her chalk. "That's actually a profound question, Jeremy. Good food isn't just sustenance. It's a reflection of care, creativity, and human connection. The more love you put in, the more people appreciate not just the meal, but the moment they're sharing." The bell above the door rang and Jane noticed the town newspaper on a table. The headline read, "Local Millionaire's Controversial Development Affects Small Businesses." She frowned, remembering the community meeting last month where she'd spoken up against Jonathan Howard's plan that had diverted promised community development funds to his private luxury resort project. Later that afternoon in the kitchen, Jane's colleague Diane nudged her. "Heard you became quite the community activist at that town hall." Howard looked ready to explode. Jane shook her head. "I just spoke the truth. What Howard is doing is technically legal, but morally questionable. Those funds were promised to help local businesses." "Well, you certainly ruffled some important feathers," Diane warned. "Howard has friends everywhere." "I'm just a simple waitress expressing an opinion," Jane replied, gathering clean dishes. "What's he going to do? Sue me for that?" What most people at Talat Diner didn't know about Jane Frank was that before finding her calling as a waitress, she had graduated with honors from law school. She'd never practiced professionally, having realized during her internships that courtroom battles weren't where she wanted to spend her life. Instead, she channeled her passion for justice into genuine connections with her customers, teaching critical thinking through heartfelt conversations across the counter. Driving home that evening, Jane's mind wandered to her grandfather, who had been her inspiration, a simple man who defended the voiceless. He taught her that understanding the law was about protecting the vulnerable, not wielding power. The worn volumes of his law books now lined her living room shelves, a quiet reminder of roads not taken. In her modest one-bedroom apartment, Jane kicked off her shoes and prepared for a quiet evening of reading. The answering machine blinked with a message. "Miss Frank, this is the clerk from the municipal court. You are being summoned regarding your business permit violation from last month. Mr. Howard will be attending. Please appear this Friday at 9 a.m. Jane frowned. Business permit violation? She had renewed her food handler's permit 3 weeks ago and had the confirmation. There should be nothing to appear for. A small knot of unease formed in her stomach as she remembered the millionaire's cold eyes at the town hall meeting, staring directly at her as she spoke. Strange, she muttered, reaching for her laptop to check the payment confirmation. Little did she know, this was just the beginning of Jonathan Howard's carefully crafted plan. Jonathan Howard's office exuded wealth and authority. Italian leather furniture, modern art adorning the walls, and a massive glass desk that made visitors feel insignificant by design. He adjusted his Rolex as he reviewed Jane Frank's file, a thin smile creasing his otherwise stern face. "Gerald," he called to his assistant. "Bring me everything you have on this waitress, Jane Frank." Gerald nodded nervously. He'd worked for Howard long enough to recognize when the man had set his sights on someone. "The summons was sent as you requested, sir." "Good." Howard leaned back in his chair, fingers forming a steeple beneath his chin. "She thinks she can stand up in a public forum and question my judgment, my reputation. I've dealt with union bosses who showed more respect." The assistant shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, it was just a community meeting, freedom of speech and all that." Howard's eyes flashed. "It's not what she said, Gerald. It's how she said it. Laying out legal precedents, questioning the statutory interpretation. She made me look incompetent in front of the entire town council." He slammed the file shut. Who does this simple waitress think she is? What truly bothered Howard wasn't just Jane's criticism, but the precision with which she had delivered it. Most citizens rambled emotionally during public comments, easily dismissed. But Jane had been different. Measured, citing relevant case law, pointing out procedural inconsistencies. It was almost as if find out everything about her education, past jobs, connections, everything, he ordered. Later that afternoon, Gerald returned with a thin folder. Not much to report, sir. She's been working at Talat Diner for 10 years. Lives alone, pays her taxes on time. No criminal record. He hesitated before adding, she did graduate from law school 15 years ago. Top of her class, actually, but never took the bar exam. Howard's eyebrows shot up. A law school graduate? He processed this information, then smiled slowly. Interesting. She knows just enough to be dangerous, but not enough to defend herself properly against someone with my resources. He turned to the window, watching clouds gather outside. Gerald, modify the summons. Change it from the permit renewal to failure to comply with health code regulations. Add a business license suspension threat. Gerald blanched. But sir, that would be fabricating. The system allows people like me discretion for a reason, Gerald. Howard cut him off. Consider it a lesson in respect for our little waitress. She'll face either closing her business or paying a substantial fine. Nothing too severe, just enough to teach her to mind her own business and perhaps a lesson on knowing her place in this town. The assistant hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. Jonathan Howard had powerful connections throughout the business community and the town. Few dared to challenge him, even when his methods skirted ethical boundaries. Most small business owners simply paid whatever he demanded rather than fight a system where he held all the cards. That evening, Howard attended a dinner with prominent community leaders, including the health department director. Between courses, he casually mentioned his concerns about politically active service workers undermining community institutions. Specifically, he said, swirling his wine, I'm troubled by this Jane Frank situation. Such behavior sets a poor example for the community, don't you think? The director nodded nervously, aware of Howard's influence over department funding. I'll look into it immediately. Howard smiled benevolently. I'm sure it's nothing serious, but waitresses should focus on serving, not criticizing successful businessmen. Wouldn't you agree? The trap was set. By the time Jane Frank entered that courtroom, she would face not only fabricated legal charges, but also professional pressure. Howard would make sure she regretted ever speaking out against him. The Talat Diner staff meeting was just wrapping up when Manager Stevens asked Jane to stay behind. His expression was uncharacteristically serious as the other servers filed out. Jane, I received a concerning call from the health department yesterday. He removed his glasses, pinching the bridge of his nose. Apparently, you've been involved in some sort of permit trouble. Jane's confusion was genuine. Permit trouble? You mean my food handler's certification? I already renewed that online. Well, that's not what I was told. Stevens slid a paper across the counter. The department mentioned a summons for health code violations and possible business license suspension. Jonathan Howard personally expressed concerns about having, how did he put it? Servers who disrespect business leaders. Jane stared at the paper, her mind racing. This doesn't make any sense. I renewed everything immediately. I have the receipt. I hope so, Stevens replied, his tone making it clear that he was caught in the middle. Because Howard hinted that this could become an employment issue if it escalates. Jane felt a cold realization wash over her. This is about the town hall meeting, isn't it? The manager's silence was answer enough. Later that day, Jane found an official court notice in her mailbox. Unlike the automated permit renewal she'd received weeks ago, this one detailed charges of health code violations and failure to maintain proper business licensing. It required her appearance before the County Business Commission in 3 days, with Jonathan Howard listed as the complainant. Her hands trembling slightly, Jane called the clerk's office. I'm sorry, Miss Frank, but our records show multiple health code violations at your station in the diner. The clerk explained impatiently. Mr. Howard has filed a formal complaint. But I've never received any notification about health code issues, Jane insisted. I renewed my certification online. I have the confirmation number right here. The system shows the renewal was processed but flagged for review due to, let me see, irregular processing, the clerk replied. You'll need to address this with the commission directly. That evening, Jane pulled a dusty box from her closet, her grandfather's case files, and legal notepads. Next, she retrieved her laptop and began researching Jonathan Howard's business history. Article after article painted the picture of a millionaire whose developments consistently displaced small businesses and community spaces. The same tactics appeared repeatedly in cases where he encountered opposition. Most interestingly, in the 6 years he'd been in town, not a single complaint against him had progressed past the initial filing stage. Jane's phone rang. It was Diane from the diner. "Jane, something weird is happening. Stevens was asking everyone about your customer interactions, whether you discuss political topics with patrons." "What's going on?" Jane's jaw tightened. "It seems our town's favorite millionaire doesn't appreciate criticism from simple folk like us." As she hung up, Jane noticed her hands had stopped trembling. The initial shock was replaced by something else, a cool analytical clarity she hadn't felt since law school. Jonathan Howard had made a critical error. He'd chosen the wrong waitress to intimidate. "Two can play this game," she whispered, opening her grandfather's old leather-bound copy of Business Law and Ethics. Jane sat cross-legged on her living room floor, surrounded by stacks of printouts, legal textbooks, and her laptop. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail as she circled patterns in Howard's business history. "It's not just me," she murmured to herself, connecting the dots. Howard had a history of using minor infractions to pursue personal vendettas. 3 years ago, a local coffee shop owner who'd refused to sell had suddenly faced licensing issues. Last year, a food truck operator who competed with one of Howard's restaurants found himself battling spurious health code violations. The pattern was clear, but subtle enough that most people simply paid fines or apologized rather than fight back. Howard was careful never to overreach too dramatically with any single case. Jane's phone buzzed with a text from Diane. "Stevens asked to watch your section tomorrow. Something about service quality review." The pressure tactics were escalating. Jane paced her apartment, legal strategies forming and dissolving in her mind. Fighting directly might protect her integrity, but could cost her job. Capitulating would mean allowing an abuse of power to continue unchallenged. Her eyes fell on a framed photo of her grandfather on her bookshelf. "What would you do?" she asked, the smiling image of the simple man who'd taught her so much. Jane picked up her grandfather's old journal, filled with notes from cases he'd worked decades ago. A yellowed newspaper clipping fell out. Her grandfather standing with a group of community members who had successfully challenged a corrupt local developer. "You don't fight power with power," she remembered him saying. "You fight it with preparation and truth." That night, Jane made 3 crucial phone calls. The first was to an old law school classmate now working at the State Business Bureau. The second was to a former regular customer who'd become an investigative journalist. The third was to the commission, leaving a message that she would represent herself at the hearing. The next morning, Jane served her section with unwavering focus despite manager Stevens observing from the counter. She noticed him taking notes when she discussed community responsibility with a table of regulars. After her shift, Stevens approached her station. "Jane, about this permit situation, maybe you should just apologize to Mr. Howard. These things can escalate unnecessarily." Jane smiled politely. "I appreciate your concern, but I believe in modeling integrity for our community. Sometimes standing up for what's right means facing uncomfortable situations." As Stevens left, Jane slipped a small digital recorder into her purse and reviewed her notes for the 100th time. Jonathan Howard thought he was setting a trap for a simple waitress who'd stepped out of line. Instead, he was about to face someone who understood the law far better than he realized and who had nothing to lose. The next 2 days passed in a blur of preparation. Jane took personal time from the diner, claiming she needed to consult with an attorney, which wasn't entirely untrue, though she was both client and counsel in this scenario. In the county law library, Jane pored over business licensing precedents and procedural rules. The elderly librarian, Mrs. Finch, recognized her focus. "Been a while since I've seen someone research so thoroughly," she remarked, helping Jane locate a specific volume on licensing proceedings. "Most folks just Google these days." Jane smiled. "My grandfather always said real legal research happens in actual books, not search engines." Mrs. Finch studied her curiously. "You're not a practicing attorney, are you?" "I know most of the local bar." "No, just a simple waitress with a legal background," Jane replied, "in a situation that requires attention to detail." Later, at the courthouse public records office, Jane requested transcripts from previous business licensing cases involving Howard Enterprises. The clerk seemed surprised by the specificity of her request. "These are unusual requests for someone representing themselves," the clerk commented, eyeing the stack of transcripts. Jane nodded. "I believe in being thorough." Back home, Jane created a detailed timeline. Her original certification, her online renewal with confirmation number, the dates of supposed violations she'd never been notified about, and the town hall meeting where she'd criticized the Millionaire's development plan. The connection was circumstantial but suggestive. Her phone rang. It was Mark Chin, her former customer now working at the local newspaper. "Miss Jane, I did some digging like you asked. Howard has quite the interesting pattern with code violations. They've increased 400% against businesses that have opposed his developments. Nothing big enough to trigger oversight, but definitely unusual. Can you get me the names of others he's targeted?" Jane asked. "Already compiled a list, emailing it now." "But Miss Jane, be careful. Howard has serious connections with the county executive and half the business community." After hanging up, Jane reviewed her case strategy once more. A direct accusation of misconduct would be dismissed without concrete evidence. Instead, she'd focus on procedural errors in her own case, establishing a pattern only if necessary. That evening, Jane carefully selected her outfit for the hearing. A simple burgundy blouse over black slacks. Professional but understated. No power suit that might telegraph her legal background. The element of surprise remained her greatest advantage. She practiced her arguments in front of her bathroom mirror, careful to strike the right tone, respectful but firm, knowledgeable but not overly legal in her language. Howard would expect a nervous waitress, intimidated by the formal proceedings and business jargon. Jane packed her grandfather's worn leather briefcase with meticulously organized evidence. Renewal confirmations, certification records, procedural rules, and relevant cases. Between two legal pads, she slipped a sealed envelope containing information she hoped wouldn't be necessary, but had prepared nevertheless. The best weapon in any battle, her grandfather used to say, is being more prepared than everyone else thinks you need to be. As she finally went to bed, Jane felt strangely calm. Tomorrow wouldn't just be about defending herself against fabricated charges. It would be about standing up against the abuse of power by those who believe their wealth put them above accountability. Win or lose, she would face Jonathan Howard on her terms, not his. The County Business Commission office bustled with morning activity. Harried attorneys shuffling papers, clerks calling names, anxious business owners waiting for their fate to be decided. Jane sat quietly in the back row, observing Howard's interactions with other small business owners before her case was called. His pattern was consistent, dismissive of their concerns, insistent on his demands, impatient with explanations. Most concerning to Jane was how frequently he interrupted self-represented individuals before they could complete their arguments. Jane noticed Gerald, the assistant she'd spoken with on the phone, avoiding eye contact with the business owners. He seemed uncomfortable, especially when Howard issued particularly harsh demands. Case number 47B, Frank, Jane, Health Code Violations and Business License Review. Gerald finally called. Jane approached the table, feeling eyes on her as she placed her grandfather's briefcase down. Jonathan Howard barely looked up from his phone, his expression one of practiced disinterest. "Miss Frank," he began, his tone condescending. "You're charged with multiple health code violations and operating with improper certification. The commission should suspend your license immediately. With respect, Mr. Howard," Jane replied, her voice steady. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding I'd like to clarify." Howard's eyebrow raised slightly. "The facts seem quite clear, Miss Frank. You were cited for violations on April 15th. When you failed to address them, this commission issued a review notice, which brings us to today." "If I may," Jane began, "I never received any notification of violations on April 15th. I renewed my certification on April 3rd, which I have confirmation for right here." She slid the printed confirmation across to the clerk, who passed it to Howard. He glanced at it dismissively. "Renewal doesn't excuse violations, Miss Frank. The inspection clearly indicated multiple problems that required immediate attention." "With respect, Mr. Howard, there was no inspection," Jane replied, producing her work schedule. "You'll see I was present at the diner every day that week, and no health inspector visited our establishment." A flicker of annoyance crossed Howard's face. "Miss Frank, perhaps at your diner, you're used to having the final word with customers. In these proceedings, I determine what constitutes proper notification and appropriate response." The condescension in his tone was evident to everyone present. Several business owners exchanged glances. "I understand your position, sir," Jane replied calmly. "However, I believe procedural due process requires actual notice before penalties can be imposed. Could the commission perhaps produce a copy of the inspection report I allegedly received?" Howard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. This was not going as he had planned. The simple waitress was supposed to be intimidated, apologetic, easy to dismiss. Proceed with caution, Miss Frank, he warned. Challenging this commission's procedures only compounds your situation. Howard leaned forward, his patience visibly thinning. The room had grown unusually quiet, other business owners pausing their conversations to watch the exchange. Miss Frank, let me be clear, Howard said, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority. This commission's records indicate proper inspection was conducted. Your failure to receive it does not constitute a defense. Jane remained composed. I understand, sir. Would it be possible to see the proof that this inspection actually occurred? Howard nodded to Gerald. Please provide Miss Frank with the standard inspection record. The assistant shuffled nervously through the file before producing a form. Jane reviewed it carefully. Mr. Howard, this form is dated April 10th, but it's not signed by any health inspector, nor is there a report detailing the specific violations. There's actually no evidence an inspection was ever conducted. A muscle twitched in Howard's jaw. Miss Frank, are you suggesting officials fabricated records? Not at all, sir. I'm simply noting that the procedural requirements for health inspections haven't been documented according to County Regulation 7.3, which requires specific findings for each alleged violation. Howard's expression darkened. Several observers shifted uncomfortably. Miss Frank, your amateur legal analysis is trying my patience. You clearly have a problem with authority, as evidenced by your inappropriate comments at the town hall meeting last month. Perhaps that's the real issue here. There it was, the connection Jane had been waiting for him to make publicly. She noticed a young reporter in the back row scribbling notes furiously. I wasn't aware my constitutionally protected speech at a public forum was relevant to a health code matter, Mr. Howard, Jane replied, her tone respectful but firm. Howard's face flushed slightly. Your attitude is precisely the problem. This commission finds sufficient evidence to suspend your food handler's license for 30 days and impose a $2,000 fine. He gathered his papers with finality, clearly expecting that to end the matter. Mr. Howard, Jane said calmly, I'd like to make a motion. This matter is concluded. Miss Frank, Howard snapped. A motion for recusal and review is always timely, sir, Jane continued. Under State Business Code Rule 2:11, interested parties shall recuse themselves when their impartiality might reasonably be questioned. The room fell completely silent. Howard stared at Jane, momentarily speechless as he realized this was no ordinary waitress. On what possible grounds, he finally managed. Jane opened her briefcase. I'd be happy to explain, sir. Jane stood perfectly straight, hands resting lightly on her grandfather's briefcase. The room remained utterly silent, all eyes fixed on the unassuming waitress who had just challenged one of the most powerful men in the county. Mr. Howard, Jane began, her voice clear and measured. I move for your recusal on 3 grounds. She withdrew a neatly organized folder. First, there's a clear appearance of bias. You just explicitly connected these proceedings to my protected speech at a town hall meeting, suggesting this case is retaliatory in nature. Howard's face darkened. Miss Frank, you're treading on dangerous ground. Second, Jane continued undeterred. There are significant procedural irregularities that suggest this matter was handled outside normal protocols. She produced a printout from the licensing system. My certification was marked, renewed, and compliant in the system on April 3rd. Yet somehow on April 9th, after the town hall meeting where I criticized your development plan, the status was manually changed to under review without notification to me. Jane turned slightly, making sure her words reached the entire room. I've submitted a public records request that shows this is the only food handler's certification in the past year to have its status changed after approval was confirmed. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. The commission secretary's fingers flew across her keyboard. Furthermore, Jane said, reaching into her briefcase again, I've documented 7 other cases where small business owners who publicly disagreed with Mr. Howard subsequently faced unusual compliance issues or procedural penalties. Howard slammed his hand on the table. That's enough. This is disruptive behavior. Which brings me to my third point, Jane said, her voice somehow both respectful and resolute. Business Code Section 2.2 requires that interested parties shall not permit family, social, political, financial, or other interests or relationships to influence the conduct or judgment of proceedings. She removed the sealed envelope she had prepared. If Mr. Howard won't recuse himself, I'm prepared to file a formal complaint with the State Business Bureau, including documentation of a pattern of using regulatory powers against critics, evidence of procedural irregularities in multiple cases, and testimony from 3 other business owners who experienced similar treatment after publicly disagreeing with Mr. Howard's development plans. The room had gone from silence to a low buzz of astonished whispers. Several business owners were frantically taking notes. The young reporter in the back had stopped writing entirely, his mouth slightly agape. Howard's face had gone from red to ashen. "Miss Frank," he said, his voice noticeably strained. "Where exactly did you acquire your legal knowledge?" Jane allowed herself a small smile. "Before I found my calling as a waitress, I graduated summa cum laude from State Law School, Mr. Howard. While I chose not to practice, I've maintained my legal education. My grandfather, a simple man but wise beyond measure, always said, 'Knowledge of the law is every citizen's best protection against its abuse.'" She placed her hands flat on the table. "I'd like the record to reflect that I've submitted evidence showing procedural irregularities, documentation of a pattern suggesting bias, and formally move for recusal and dismissal. If denied, I'm prepared to appeal immediately under the collateral order doctrine, which allows interlocutory appeal of recusal denials as established in Hampton v. County Business Commission." Howard stared at Jane, the realization dawning that his simple intimidation tactic had backfired catastrophically. The simple waitress had not only recognized his trap, but had set one of her own, and he had walked right into it. The tension in the room was palpable as Howard stared at Jane before announcing a 15-minute recess. Behind closed doors, the millionaire's demeanor had changed completely. "What exactly do you want, Miss Frank?" he asked, his earlier arrogance replaced with controlled anger. "Justice," Jane replied steadily. "Dismissal of these fabricated charges, notation they were dismissed with prejudice, your recusal from any matters involving me or Talat Diner, and your withdrawal from the zoning board that approves small business permits." She also presented a list of 7 similar cases deserving review. Upon returning to the hearing room, Howard announced in a clipped voice that all charges were dismissed with prejudice, and he recused himself from future matters involving her to avoid any appearance of impropriety. He also tendered his resignation from the zoning board, citing other business commitments. Outside, a reporter approached. "Miss Frank, would you comment on what happened?" Jane smiled. "Our community works best when everyone understands their rights, including millionaires." 2 weeks later, Jane served breakfast to her regulars when manager Stevens and the diner owner entered. After her shift, Stevens approached. "I owe you an apology. I should have supported you. You were in a difficult position," Jane replied graciously. "Things have changed," the owner added. "Howard has stepped back from several community boards, and our renovation loan has been approved." That evening, Jane found her grandfather's law school diploma with a note from her coworkers, "To our simple waitress with not-so-simple courage. Thank you for teaching us that standing up for what's right matters." She smiled, running her fingers over his law books. Perhaps serving others truly was the path to justice, whether through legal briefs or the perfect cup of coffee. The end. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe for more inspiring tales of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Share your thoughts below. Have you ever stood against someone who abused their power? Remember, true power comes from knowledge and courage to stand for what's right.